The dust swirled around Jake Morrison's weathered boots as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside Murphy's General Store. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the wooden sidewalks that stretched like broken fingers between the scattered buildings. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, his saddlebags heavy with the earnings from a cattle drive that had taken him clear to Denver and back through some of the most unforgiving country this side of hell. All he wanted was a cold drink, a hot meal, and maybe a soft bed before continuing his journey home to his small ranch outside of town, where nothing but silence and memories waited for him. As he stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, the spurs on his boots jingling softly in the late afternoon stillness, Jake noticed a small figure huddled beside the store's entrance like a shadow trying to hide from the light. At first glance, he thought it might be a young boy seeking shelter from the heat, but as he drew closer, adjusting his hat against the glare, he could see it was a girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, with long brown hair that had seen better days and clothes that were patched and worn thin as old parchment. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them like she was trying to hold herself together, and there was something about her posture that spoke of deep exhaustion and a despair that seemed far too heavy for someone so young to carry. Jake paused, his calloused hand resting on the door handle, feeling the familiar weight of his Colt at his hip, and the even more familiar weight of loneliness in his chest. He'd learned long ago that in the frontier, minding your own business was often the safest course. The difference between living to see another sunset and ending up face down in the dust with a bullet in your back. But something about the girl's stillness, the way she seemed to be trying to make herself invisible while simultaneously hoping someone would notice her, tugged at something deep in his chest that he'd thought was buried forever. He thought of his own daughter, Emma, who would be about this girl's age, now if she'd lived past her 3rd winter, before the fever took her and left him with nothing but an empty house and a heart full of regrets. The girl looked up as his shadow fell across her, and Jake saw eyes that were far too old for her young face, eyes that had seen too much and understood too little about why the world had to be so cruel. They were the color of sage, green with flecks of gray like storm clouds, and they held a wariness that reminded him of his own reflection in the mirror on the mornings when he couldn't bring himself to shave or eat, or do anything but stare at the ceiling and remember what it felt like to have a reason to get out of bed. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his dusty clothes, the gun at his hip, the lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who'd seen both the beauty and the cruelty of the world and somehow managed to survive both. "You all right, miss?" Jake asked, his voice gentler than most people in Cedar Ridge had ever heard it, softer than the wind that whistled through the canyon walls at night. He was known as a man of few words, someone who kept to himself and expected others to do the same, someone who'd learned that caring too much about other people's troubles was a sure way to end up with troubles of your own. But something about this girl, something about the way she looked at him with those ancient eyes, made him want to break his own rules and remember what it felt like to be the kind of man who helped people instead of just walking past them. The girl's eyes darted around nervously, as if she were checking to make sure no one else was listening, that no one would overhear her shame and judge her for it. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were practicing the words she wanted to say, and Jake could see her hands trembling where they gripped her knees. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but Jake caught every word because he'd learned to listen carefully to the things people said. When they thought no one was paying attention, when they were at the end of their rope and had nothing left to lose. "Mima's a widow and she's awfully sick," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for a long time, as if saying them out loud made them more real and more terrifying. "Can anyone help us?" Jake felt his heart clench like a fist in his chest, that familiar pain that came whenever he was reminded of his own losses, his own failures, his own inability to save the people he loved most. He'd heard variations of this story before, especially since the war had ended and left so many women and children to fend for themselves in a world that seemed designed to break them down. But hearing it from this particular girl, seeing the way her small hands trembled as she spoke, seeing the desperation in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide, made it feel as real and immediate as his own pain, As fresh as the day he'd buried his wife and daughter, and sworn he'd never let himself care about anyone again. "What's your name, child?" he asked, crouching down slowly so he could look her in the eye without towering over her like some kind of threat. Up close, he could see that she was thinner than she should be, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had been touched by too much sun and not enough good food, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that spoke of too many missed meals and too much worry for someone so young. "Sarah," she replied, her voice growing slightly stronger now that she'd taken the first step, now that someone was actually listening to her instead of walking past like she didn't exist. "Sarah Clemens. My mo is Elizabeth Clemens, and we live in the old Murphy cabin about 2 miles outside of town, past the creek where the cottonwoods grow. She's been sick for near on 3 weeks now, and I don't know what to do anymore. I've tried everything I can think of, but nothing seems to help." Jake had heard the name Elizabeth Clemens before, though he couldn't place exactly where or when. Cedar Ridge was small enough that most people knew of each other, even if they didn't know each other well, and news traveled fast in a place where everyone's business was everyone else's entertainment. He tried to remember what he'd heard about the Clemens family, searching his memory for details that might help him understand what he was getting himself into. But his recollections were fuzzy and incomplete, like trying to remember a dream after waking up. "What kind of sick?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew from the way Sarah's face crumpled slightly at the question. There had been talk of fever going around the area, the kind that came with the changing seasons and took hold of people who were already worn down by life, already weakened by loss and hardship and the simple struggle of trying to survive in a place that seemed determined to kill anyone who wasn't strong enough to fight back. "She's got the fever that won't break," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly, and Jake could hear the fear beneath the words, the terror of a child who was watching her mother slip away and didn't know how to stop it. "It comes and goes, but it's been getting worse these past few days. And she can't keep much food down, just throws up anything I try to give her. I've been doing what I can, but I'm not much good at cooking, and we don't have money for the doctor. Pi died last spring in a mining accident up at the Silver Creek mine, and we've been trying to make it on our own ever since." Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a familiar weight that he'd carried for years settling more heavily on his shoulders like a burden he'd never be able to put down. He thought of his own wife, Mary, who died trying to bring their second child into the world, bleeding to death in their bed while he held her hand, helpless to stop it. He thought of little Emma, who'd followed her mother into the ground just 2 years later, taken by the same kind of fever that seemed to be afflicting Sarah's mother, leaving him alone in a house that echoed with memories and regrets. He thought of all the times he'd wished someone, anyone, had been there to help when his own world was falling apart, when he'd been the one sitting in the dirt, begging strangers for assistance that never came. "Where's your kin?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would be the same story he'd heard 100 times before. If Sarah had family nearby, family who cared enough to help, she wouldn't be sitting outside the general store whispering to strangers and trying to swallow her pride long enough to ask for help. "Mai's people are back in Missouri, and Pi's brother lives clear up in Montana territory," Sarah said, her voice growing smaller with each word, as if she were shrinking into herself with the weight of her isolation. "We wrote to them after Pa died, but letters take so long out here, and even if they wanted to help, I don't think we can wait much longer. Ma's getting worse every day, and I'm scared she's gonna die if someone doesn't do something soon." Jake stood up slowly, his joints protesting after the long days in the saddle, feeling every one of his 42 years in the ache of his bones and the stiffness of muscles that had been pushed too hard for too long. He looked down at Sarah, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and fear in those sage-colored eyes, waiting for him to make a decision that would either save her family or crush the last bit of hope she had left. He could walk away right now, go into the store, get his supplies, and continue on his way to his empty ranch and his empty life. No one would think less of him for it, and in fact, most people would probably think he was being smart by not getting involved in someone else's troubles, by not taking on responsibilities that weren't his to carry. But as he looked at Sarah, really looked at her, he saw something that made his decision for him. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the fear and exhaustion that lined her young face like premature wrinkles, despite the way her clothes hung on her thin frame, and her hands shook when she thought he wasn't looking. There was a strength there that reminded him of Mary. It was the kind of strength that came from loving someone so much that you'd do anything, face any hardship, endure any humiliation, sacrifice any part of yourself to keep them safe. It was the kind of strength that made a 12-year-old girl swallow her pride and beg strangers for help because the alternative was watching her mother die. "Show me," he said simply, the words coming out before he could second, guess himself or think about all the reasons why getting involved was a bad idea. Sarah's eyes widened, and for a moment, Jake thought she might cry, thought the relief might be too much for her to handle. Instead, she scrambled to her feet with the quick energy of youth. Though he could see the exhaustion in every line of her body, the way she swayed slightly as she stood up, as if she hadn't been eating enough or sleeping enough or taking care of herself while she worried about her mother. "You'll really come?" she asked, as if she couldn't quite believe it, as if she'd been rejected so many times that kindness seemed impossible. "I'll come," Jake confirmed, adjusting his hat and checking his horse's reins. "But first, we need to get some supplies. Your Mez going to need medicine, and you're both going to need food. Can't help anybody if we don't have the right tools for the job." Sarah's face fell slightly, and Jake could see her retreat into herself again, the hope flickering in her eyes like a candle in the wind. "I don't have any money," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of the wind rustling through the buildings. "I've been doing some washing for Mrs. Henderson and helping at the bakery when they need extra hands, but it's not much, and I used most of it for flour last week when the barrel got low." Jake waved her concern away with a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. "Don't worry about that right now," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Let's just focus on getting your ma better. Everything else can wait." They went into Murphy's general store together, the bell above the door chiming softly as they entered the dim interior that smelled of leather and tobacco and the 1,000 different scents that came from having everything a frontier town needed crammed into one small space. Jake was struck by how small Sarah looked among the shelves of goods, how she moved carefully as if she were afraid to touch anything, as if she were a trespasser in a place where she didn't belong. He realized that it had probably been a long time since she'd been in a store where she could afford to buy what she needed, where she could walk down the aisles without calculating the cost of every item and weighing it against their meager resources. Murphy himself was behind the counter, a stout man with graying hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing, the kind of man who'd built his business by understanding people and knowing what they needed before they asked for it. He looked up as they entered, his gaze moving from Jake to Sarah and back again, and Jake could see the wheels turning in the storekeeper's mind as he tried to figure out what was happening. "Afternoon, Morrison," Murphy said with a nod that held the kind of respect that came from years of honest dealing. "What can I do for you today? You look like you've been riding hard." "Need some medicine," Jake replied, his voice steady and businesslike. "Fever remedy if you've got it. And some other supplies. We've got a sick woman needs tending to." Murphy's eyes flicked to Sarah again, and Jake saw recognition dawn in them like sunrise over the mountains. "This wouldn't be for the Clemens woman, would it?" he asked, his voice careful, as if he were walking on ground that might give way beneath him. "That's right," Jake said, his tone making it clear that he didn't want to discuss it further, that this was business and nothing more. Murphy nodded and began gathering items from behind the counter with the efficiency of a man who'd done this dance many times before. Jake watched him work, noting the way the storekeeper's movements were quick and practiced, as if he'd prepared similar packages for other families in similar situations. It made Jake wonder how many other people in the area were struggling, how many other mothers were sick while their children tried desperately to care for them, how many other stories like Sarah's were playing out in cabins and homesteads scattered across the territory. "I've got some willow bark powder," Murphy said, holding up a small cloth bag that looked insignificant but might be the difference between life and death. "It's good for bringing down fever, better than anything else I've got. And there's some peppermint tea that might help settle her stomach, make it easier for her to keep food down." Jake nodded and pointed to other items around the store, his mind already working through what they would need. "We'll need some chicken broth, the kind that comes in cans, Some crackers that won't upset her stomach. Maybe some of that honey you keep behind the counter. And some oats and flour for the girl, and maybe some salt pork if you've got it. As Murphy gathered the items, Jake noticed Sarah watching everything with wide eyes, as if she were witnessing a miracle. She seemed almost afraid to breathe, as if she might wake up and find it was all a dream, as if kindness was so foreign to her experience that she couldn't quite believe it was real. When Murphy began tallying up the cost, adding numbers in his head with the speed of long practice, Jake saw her face fall and her shoulders slump, and he quickly stepped forward before she could say anything. "Put it all on my account," he said firmly, his voice brooking no argument. "Jake, you don't have to." Sarah began, but he cut her off with a gentle but firm look that reminded her that some arguments weren't worth having. "It's already decided," he said, his voice quiet but final. "Now, let's get going. Your ma needs this medicine, and every minute we waste here is a minute she's not getting better." The ride to the Clemens cabin was quiet except for the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves on the dusty trail. With Sarah sitting behind him on the saddle and clutching the bag of supplies like it contained the most precious treasure in the world, Jake could feel her small form trembling against his back, whether from exhaustion, worry, or relief he couldn't tell. Probably all three, he thought, remembering his own daughter and the way she used to cling to him when she was scared or tired, or just needed the comfort of knowing someone bigger and stronger was there to protect her. The cabin, when they reached it, was smaller than Jake had expected. One of the older structures in the area that had been built by the original Murphy family before they'd moved into town and opened the store. It was constructed from logs that had weathered to a silvery gray, with chinking that needed repair and a roof that showed signs of hard winters and harder times. The small garden beside the house showed signs of neglect, with weeds growing among the vegetables and the fence sagging in places where the posts had rotted. But it was clean, and Jake could see that Sarah had been doing her best to maintain it, that she'd been fighting a losing battle against poverty and illness, and the simple fact that there was too much work for one small girl to handle. "Ma's inside," Sarah said as they dismounted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been sleeping a lot, but she wakes up sometimes when the fever breaks. She tries to talk to me, but I can tell it hurts her." Jake tied his horse to a post near the cabin and followed Sarah inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior that smelled of sickness and wood smoke and something else, something that reminded him of his own house after Mary died, the smell of despair and loneliness and dreams that had withered on the vine. There was a small main room with a stone fireplace, a table and 2 chairs that had seen better days, and a few other basic furnishings that spoke of people who'd once had more but had slowly sold or traded away everything that wasn't absolutely necessary for survival. A doorway covered by a faded curtain led to what Jake assumed was the bedroom, and he could hear the sound of labored breathing coming from that direction, the kind of breathing that spoke of a body fighting a battle it might not win. Sarah approached the doorway carefully, as if she were afraid of what she might find. "Ma," she called softly, her voice filled with a tenderness that made Jake's heart ache. "Ma, I brought someone to help." The woman lying in the bed was clearly very ill, her face flushed with fever that had burned away too much of her strength and left her looking fragile as old paper. Her breathing was shallow and labored, and even from the doorway, Jake could see the way her chest rose and fell with effort that spoke of pneumonia or something equally serious. She looked to be in her 30s. With brown hair similar to Sarah's but dulled by illness and exhaustion, and where Sarah's eyes held strength despite their wariness, Elizabeth Clemens's eyes were glazed with fever and pain and something that looked like resignation. "Who's there?" she asked weakly, trying to focus on Jake through the haze of sickness that seemed to surround her like fog. "This is Mr. Morrison, Ma," Sarah said, moving to her mother's side and taking her hand with a gentleness that spoke of weeks of practice. "He's going to help us get you better." Elizabeth's eyes cleared slightly as she looked at Jake, and he could see her trying to gather enough strength to be polite, to be the kind of woman who welcomed strangers into her home with grace and dignity even when she was dying. We can't pay," she began, but Jake held up a hand to stop her before she could finish the sentence. "Don't worry about that now, Mrs. Clemens," he said gently, his voice holding the same tone he'd once used with Emma when she was sick or scared. "Let's just focus on getting you better. Everything else can wait." Over the next several hours, Jake found himself doing things he hadn't done in years. Things that reminded him of the man he'd been before loss and grief had turned him into someone who kept the world at arm's length. He helped Sarah prepare the willow bark tea, showing her how to measure the powder and steep it properly so it would be most effective. He taught her how to make a proper chicken broth from the canned goods they'd brought, adding herbs he found growing wild near the cabin to make it more palatable and nutritious. He even helped her clean the cabin while her mother slept, organizing the few possessions they had and making small repairs that he could manage with the tools he found in the shed out back. It felt strange at first, these domestic tasks that reminded him so much of his life with Mary, of the routines they'd established and the comfortable rhythms of a shared existence. But gradually he found himself settling into a pattern that felt almost natural, as if some part of him had been waiting for this opportunity to be useful again, to be needed by someone who wasn't afraid to accept help when it was offered freely. Sarah watched him work with a mixture of amazement and gratitude, her eyes following his every movement, as if she were trying to memorize everything he did so she could continue his work after he left. "You know a lot about taking care of sick people," she observed as he showed her how to prepare a cool compress for her mother's forehead, how to wring out the cloth so it would be soothing without being too cold. "I've had some experience," Jake replied quietly, his hands stilling for a moment as memories threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't elaborate without opening doors he'd spent years keeping closed, but something in his tone made Sarah look at him more closely. "You lost someone," she said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that came from recognizing pain in someone else because you'd felt it yourself. Jake paused in his work, the cloth he was wringing out dripping water onto the floor as he considered how to respond. For years he deflected such observations, changed the subject, or simply walked away when people got too close to the truth. But something about Sarah's direct gaze, the way she'd stated the truth so simply and without pity, made him want to be honest with her in a way he hadn't been honest with anyone in a long time. "My wife and daughter," he said finally, the words coming out rough and painful, like swallowing broken glass. "A long time ago." Sarah nodded as if this explained everything, as if his willingness to help them suddenly made perfect sense. "That's why you're helping us," she said, her voice filled with understanding beyond her years. "Because you know what it's like to lose someone you love." Jake looked at her, this wise young girl who saw so much more than she should have to see, who understood connections and motivations that many adults would miss. "Maybe," he said, his voice uncertain. "Or maybe I'm helping because it's the right thing to do." "Both," Sarah said with the kind of certainty that comes from hard-won wisdom. "It's both." As the evening wore on and the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Jake of better times, Elizabeth's fever began to break slightly. The willow bark tea seemed to be helping, and she was able to keep down some of the broth that Jake and Sarah had prepared together. For the first time in weeks, Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of what she might look like when she wasn't carrying the weight of the world on her thin shoulders. "She's getting better," Sarah said, her voice filled with a wonder that made Jake's heart ache for all the simple joys she'd been denied. "I can tell. She's really getting better." "She's got a long way to go yet," Jake cautioned, not wanting to raise false hopes, but he couldn't help but smile at the light in Sarah's eyes. "But this is a good start. Real good start." They settled in for the night with Jake spreading his bedroll by the fire and Sarah curling up in a chair beside her mother's bed, unwilling to leave her side even for the few hours of sleep she desperately needed. Jake lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around him and thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. He'd come to Cedar Ridge planning to pick up supplies and move on, to continue the endless journey that had become his life since Mary and Emma died. But now he found himself deeply involved in the lives of these two strangers, caring about their welfare in a way that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. The next morning brought new challenges and new hopes. Elizabeth's fever had returned during the night, though not as severely as before, and she was struggling to eat anything more substantial than broth. But she was more alert, more aware of her surroundings, and Jake could see the intelligence in her eyes that illness had been hiding. She watched him as he worked, and he could feel her trying to figure out who he was, and why he was helping them. "I need to go back to town," he told Sarah as they worked together to prepare another dose of medicine. "We need more supplies, and I want to talk to Doc Patterson about your mother's condition. Get his opinion on what we should be doing." Sarah's face immediately filled with worry, and Jake saw the fear that had been hiding just beneath the surface of her newfound hope. "You're not leaving for good, are you?" she asked, and he could hear the desperation in her voice, the terror of a child who'd been abandoned too many times to trust easily. "No," he said firmly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised him. "I'll be back before evening, I promise. But I need you to watch over your mother while I'm gone. Keep giving her the medicine and the broth. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the weight of responsibility that seemed too heavy for someone so young. She was so small to be carrying such a burden, and he felt a familiar anger at the unfairness of life, at the way the world seemed designed to test people beyond their limits. But he also saw the strength in her, the same strength that had allowed her to care for her mother for weeks before swallowing her pride and asking for help. The ride back to Cedar Ridge gave Jake time to think about what he was doing, to examine the choices he'd made and the path he seemed to be walking without conscious decision. He'd told Sarah he would be back, but he hadn't really thought about what that meant. Was he planning to stay until Elizabeth recovered? And what then? He had his own ranch to think about, his own life to get back to, his own carefully constructed isolation to maintain. But as he thought about leaving Sarah and Elizabeth to manage on their own, something in his chest tightened like a fist. He'd been living alone for so long, keeping everyone at arm's length, that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be needed, to have someone depend on him for more than just a day's work or a quick favor. These two women had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead and buried with Mary and Emma. Something that made him want to be better than he'd been, stronger than he'd allowed himself to be. Doc Patterson was a thin, elderly man with kind eyes and gentle hands who'd been practicing medicine on the frontier for more than 30 years. He'd seen everything the territory could throw at a person, had delivered babies and treated gunshot wounds, and held the hands of dying men who had no one else to comfort them in their final moments. He listened carefully as Jake described Elizabeth's symptoms, nodding occasionally and asking pointed questions that showed he understood the seriousness of the situation. "Sounds like she's got what's been going around," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It's a stubborn fever, pneumonia most likely, but it's not usually fatal if it's treated properly and the patient's strong enough to fight it." The willow bark was a good choice, and the fact that she's been able to keep some food down is encouraging. "What else can we do?" Jake asked, feeling the urgency that came from caring about someone else's welfare. "Keep doing what you're doing," Doc Patterson replied, reaching for his medical bag. "Rest, fluids, and time. That's what she needs most. But I'll put together some stronger medicine just in case the fever comes back hard. And here's some laudanum for the pain, just a few drops in water when she needs it." Jake also stopped by the general store to get more supplies, and he found himself buying things he hadn't intended to purchase, things that spoke of a commitment he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Fabric for new clothes for Sarah, whose current outfit was patched beyond repair. A few books, because he'd noticed the cabin had none, and Sarah seemed like the kind of girl who would appreciate reading. Some tools that he could use to repair the cabin's roof and fix the fence around the garden. Murphy raised an eyebrow as Jake added item after item to his growing order, planning to stay out there for a while. He asked, his tone carefully neutral. Jake paused in his selections, considering the question that cut closer to the truth than he was comfortable admitting. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but they need help, and I'm able to provide it. Seems like the right thing to do." Murphy nodded approvingly, his expression showing the kind of respect that came from recognizing genuine compassion. "Elizabeth Clemens is a good woman," he said, wrapping the purchases in brown paper. "She's been struggling since her husband died, but she's got pride. Won't take charity from just anyone. You're doing a good thing, Morrison." When Jake returned to the cabin, he found Sarah sitting by her mother's bed, reading to her from an old Bible that looked like it had been in the family for generations. Elizabeth looked better than she had the day before. Her color improved and her breathing easier, though she was still obviously weak. She smiled when she saw Jake enter, and he could see gratitude in her eyes that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice stronger than it had been since he'd arrived. Sarah told me what you've been doing for us.
I don't know how to thank you.
No need for thanks, Jake replied, settling into the chair beside the bed and trying to ignore the way the simple domestic scene made him feel. How are you feeling? Better, Elizabeth said, and Jake could see that she meant it. Tired but better. Sarah says you've been taking care of us like we were your own family. Jake glanced at Sarah, who was watching him with those wise eyes that seemed to see everything. You've got a good daughter, he said to Elizabeth, deflecting the comment. She's been doing a fine job taking care of you. She's all I have left, Elizabeth said softly, reaching out to touch Sarah's hand with fingers that trembled slightly. I don't know what I would have done if something had happened to me. She's too young to be alone in the world. Nothing's going to happen to you, Jake said firmly, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. You're going to get better, and you're going to be around to see Sarah grow up and have children of her own. Over the next few days, Jake fell into a routine at the cabin that felt more natural than anything he'd experienced in years. He worked on repairs during the day, his hands remembering skills he'd thought he'd forgotten, and helped Sarah with her mother's care, teaching her things about medicine and cooking that might serve her well in the future. In the evenings, he found himself staying for dinner and conversation, drawn by the warmth of human connection that he'd been denying himself for so long. Elizabeth grew stronger each day, her fever breaking permanently and her appetite returning slowly but steadily. Sarah began to look like a normal young girl again, instead of someone carrying the weight of the world, and Jake found himself smiling more often than he had in years. It was dangerous, this feeling of belonging, this sense that he might have found something worth staying for. It was on the fourth evening that Elizabeth brought up the subject Jake had been dreading, the conversation he knew was coming, but had been avoiding thinking about. You can't stay here forever, she said quietly. They were sitting by the fire after Sarah had gone to bed, and Elizabeth was wrapped in a quilt, looking healthier than she had since Jake had arrived, but still fragile in the way that people are when they're recovering from serious illness. I know, Jake replied, but he didn't look at her, couldn't meet her eyes when he said it. You have your own life to get back to. Elizabeth continued, her voice gentle but insistent. Your own ranch, your own responsibilities. You can't put your life on hold indefinitely for two strangers. Jake poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up the chimney and buying himself time to think. Ranch has been empty for years, he said finally. I've been drifting, working cattle drives, taking whatever jobs I could find. Haven't had a real home in a long time. Elizabeth studied his profile in the firelight, seeing the pain he was trying to hide and the loneliness that had become such a part of him that he'd forgotten what it felt like to live without it. Is that what you want? She asked softly. To keep drifting. It was a question Jake had been asking himself for days, a question that cut to the heart of everything he'd been running from. When he'd first arrived at the cabin, he'd been planning to help them get back on their feet and then move on, to continue the endless journey that had become his life. But somehow, in the space of less than a week, this place had begun to feel like something he'd forgotten existed, something he'd thought he'd lost forever. It felt like home. I don't know, he said honestly, his voice rough with emotion. I've been alone for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. Sarah's gotten attached to you, Elizabeth said softly, and Jake could hear the concern in her voice. She talks about you constantly when you're not here. About how you showed her the proper way to tend a garden. How you're going to teach her to ride a horse properly. How you're going to help her learn to read better. She's making plans that include you. Jake felt his heart clench at the thought of disappointing Sarah, of being another person who walked out of her life when things got complicated. She's a good girl, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Deserves better than what life's given her so far. She deserves to have someone who cares about her, Elizabeth said, her voice carrying the weight of a mother's love and a mother's fear. Someone who'll be there for her, who won't disappear when things get hard. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. Finally, Elizabeth spoke again, her voice serious in a way that made Jake look at her directly for the first time since the conversation began. I need to ask you something, she said, her eyes meeting his across the flames. And I need you to be honest with me, even if the